The landlord warned him the old house made strange noises, but he never mentioned that the previous owner was still coming home every night to do his chores. Welcome to Echoed Chronicles. Tonight's story concerns a young geologist who discovered that the cheapest rent can sometimes come at the highest cost. The job offer had been a lifeline, a solid branch extended over the choppy waters of postgraduate uncertainty. Caleb had finished his degree in geology 6 months prior, and the reality of the market was a far cry from the optimistic projections of his university's career services department. He'd sent out over 100 applications, each one a carefully tailored message in a bottle tossed into the vast, indifferent ocean of corporate HR portals. The response from Northgate Environmental Solutions was the first one that felt real. It was a 6-month contract position, geological surveyor. The pay was decent, not spectacular, but it was experience. Crucially, it was a start. The only catch was the location. Logan, Ohio, tucked away in the rolling, densely wooded Hocking Hills region. It was a world away from the flat, predictable grid of Columbus where he'd spent the last 4 years. The project involved surveying a large tract of land adjacent to a defunct glass manufacturing plant, checking for soil and groundwater contamination. It was exactly the kind of hands-on fieldwork he'd been hoping for. Finding a place to live on short notice and a tight budget was the real challenge. Apartment complexes in the area wanted year-long leases, and the few short-term rentals were priced for the tourist season, catering to hikers and leaf peepers. Then he found the listing on a fringe rental site he'd almost given up on. An entire house for $700 a month. The pictures were grainy, but they showed a 2-story farmhouse, white paint peeling in long strips, with a wide front porch and a tin roof. It was described as rustic and secluded. The landlord, a man named Mr. Abernathy, lived in Cleveland and handled everything over the phone. He was gruff but efficient. He didn't require a credit check or references, just the first month's rent and a modest security deposit wired to his account. A key would be waiting in a lockbox on the porch. "It's an old house, son," Abernathy had said, his voice a gravelly rumble through Caleb's phone. "Got its own well and a septic tank. You know what that means? It means I don't call you if the water bill is high," Caleb had replied, trying for a bit of levity. The man hadn't laughed. "It means you're on your own out there. The nearest neighbor is a 1/4 mile down the road. Keep that in mind." Now, bumping along the cracked asphalt of County Road 21, Caleb's 2012 Honda Civic felt small and fragile beneath the canopy of ancient oaks and maples. The GPS had lost its signal 2 miles back, and he was navigating by a set of hand-scrawled directions Abernathy had emailed him. "Turn left at the stone-carved eagle, then it's the 3rd driveway on the right." The driveway, when he finally found it, was little more than 2 ruts in the earth, disappearing into a wall of greenery. He took a deep breath and turned the wheel. Branches scraped against the sides of the car with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The house emerged from the trees suddenly, looking exactly like the photos, only more so. The peeling paint seemed more pronounced, the sag of the porch more dramatic. A thicket of overgrown rose bushes, gone wild and thorny, crowded the foundation. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, honeysuckle, and something else, a faint, musty smell like wet, forgotten laundry. It wasn't just secluded, it felt forgotten. He parked the car in the patchy, weed-choked yard and got out. The humidity of the late August afternoon settled on him like a heavy blanket. The only sound was the drone of cicadas, a relentless, high-pitched thrum that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. He found the lockbox on a porch column, fumbled with the combination Abernathy had given him, and retrieved a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key. The lock was stiff, and he had to jiggle the key and put his shoulder into the door before it swung open with a groan of protest. The musty smell was stronger inside. The air was still and hot. The house was sparsely furnished, just as the landlord had promised. A faded floral print sofa sat in the living room, its cushions permanently indented. A heavy, dark wood dining table with 4 mismatched chairs occupied the next room. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the grimy windows. Caleb walked through the downstairs rooms, his footsteps echoing on the bare hardwood floors. The kitchen was at the back of the house. It had an ancient-looking porcelain sink, stained with rust, and a gas stove that looked like it belonged in a museum. He tried a faucet. After a moment of sputtering and clanking from pipes somewhere deep in the house's guts, a stream of water, cloudy at first, then clear, gushed into the basin. It smelled faintly of sulfur. Well, water. He made a mental note to buy bottled water for drinking. He spent the next few hours unpacking his car, carrying in boxes of clothes, books, and his surveying equipment, the expensive GPS rover, the transit, the case of marking flags. He decided to leave the equipment in the back of the Civic for the night, covered by a tarp. Felt safer there than in the house. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, he made a quick trip back into Logan. He found a Kroger and stocked up on the essentials. Bread, eggs, coffee, a case of bottled water, and a family-sized bag of pretzels. He ate dinner in his car in the parking lot, the fluorescent lights of the store feeling like a beacon of civilization. He called his sister, Alara, to let her know he'd arrived safely. "How is it?" she asked, her voice clear and familiar. "It's rustic," he said, repeating the landlord's word. "Definitely an old house, but it's big and quiet. Too quiet." "No such thing," he said, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The silence out there wasn't just an absence of noise. It felt like a presence, something that pressed in at the edges. "I start work tomorrow morning. I need to meet the project manager at the site at 8. "Okay, well, get some sleep. And Cal? Maybe buy a new lock for the door or something. A place that cheap just feels weird." "I'll be fine, Elle. I'll call you in a couple of days." When he got back to the house, night had fallen completely. The darkness was absolute, a thick, inky blackness that the Honda's headlights could barely penetrate. He killed the engine and the world was plunged into a profound silence, the cicadas having finally given up their song. For a long moment, he just sat in the car, feeling an inexplicable reluctance to get out. It was foolish, he told himself. It was just a house, an old, empty house. He finally forced himself out, grabbing his groceries, and hurried up the porch steps. Inside, he locked the door behind him, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying thud. But Alara's words had planted a seed of unease. He walked through the downstairs, checking the windows. They were old, single-pane glass, held shut by simple sash locks. Most were painted shut, but he found one in the dining room that slid open with a screech of protest. He forced it back down and made sure the lock was turned. He brought his duffel bag upstairs to the larger of the two bedrooms. It contained a simple iron-frame bed with a thin mattress. He spread his sleeping bag over it, not wanting to think about how long the mattress had been there. The room was stuffy, so he tried to open a window, but it wouldn't budge. He gave up and stripped down to his boxers, the humid air clinging to his skin. Sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the old house was magnified in the silence. The groan of a floorboard, the ticking of the cooling pipes, the whisper of a breeze against the window pane. He kept thinking he heard other sounds, too. A soft scraping noise from downstairs, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside a wall. He told himself it was just the house settling, or a mouse, or a branch brushing against the siding. He was a man of science, of observable phenomena. There was a rational explanation for everything. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he drifted into a restless, dream-filled sleep. He woke with a start. The room was still dark, but a pale, pre-dawn light was beginning to filter through the window. It wasn't a noise that had woken him. It was a feeling, a subtle change in the atmosphere of the room. He lay perfectly still, listening. The house was silent. He sat up, swinging his legs off the bed. The floorboards were cool against his bare feet. And that's when he saw it. The door to his bedroom, which he was certain he had closed before falling asleep, was now open. Just a crack, a dark, vertical slice in the gloom. He stared at it, his heart starting to thump against his ribs. He must have left it open. He was tired, disoriented from the move. He must have thought he'd closed it but hadn't pushed it all the way to the latch. That was the only logical explanation. He stood up and walked to the door, his hand reaching out to close it. As his fingers touched the cool brass of the doorknob, he paused. He looked down the hallway. The darkness was absolute. There was nothing to see. Still, he couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that he was not alone. He quietly pushed the door shut, making sure he heard the soft click of the latch engaging this time. He then dragged the room's only other piece of furniture, a small, rickety wooden chair, and wedged it under the doorknob. It was an irrational act, and he knew it, but it made him feel marginally safer. He crawled back into his sleeping bag, but sleep was now impossible. He lay awake, listening to the silence, until the sun finally rose. The first day of work was a welcome distraction. His project manager, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Brenda, met him at the gated entrance to the old factory property. She handed him a set of detailed topographical maps and a hard hat. The work was demanding, requiring intense focus. He spent the day setting up control points, driving stakes into the hard, clay-rich soil, and taking initial readings with the GPS rover. The physical exertion felt good, burning off the nervous energy from the previous night. He worked until nearly 6, then drove back to the house, stopping again in town for a pizza. He ate it standing in the kitchen, the box resting on the counter. He was determined to establish a routine, to domesticate the unsettling space and make it his own. After eating, he took a lukewarm shower. The house's water heater was ancient and temperamental, and decided to explore the rest of the property before it got dark. The back door of the kitchen led out onto a small, concrete porch with a crumbling set of steps. The backyard was even more overgrown than the front, a tangle of waist-high weeds and invasive vines. A collapsed barbed wire fence marked what he assumed was the property line, beyond which the dense forest began. To the right stood a dilapidated wooden shed, its door hanging from a single rusty hinge. Curiosity overriding his caution, he walked over to it. The wood was soft and rotting. He peered inside. It was filled with old junk, rusted paint cans, a stack of bald tires, a shattered terracotta pot, and something else. In the back corner, half hidden behind a pile of rotting burlap sacks, was a small, child-sized rocking chair. It was wooden, painted a pale blue that had mostly flaked away. It was strangely clean compared to everything else in the shed, with very little dust on its seat. It looked as if it had been placed there recently. A chill, unrelated to the evening air, traced a path down his spine. It was just an old toy, left by a previous tenant, maybe a family with a child. But why would it be so clean? He backed away from the shed, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He had the distinct and powerful feeling of being watched. He scanned the tree line, a dark, impenetrable wall of green and black. He saw nothing but leaves and shadows. No movement, no sign of anyone. Yet the feeling persisted, a primal instinct screaming that he was not alone. He retreated back into the house, locking the back door firmly behind him. That night, he barricaded his bedroom door with the chair again. He also took one of his heavy steel-toed work boots and set it on the floor just inside the door, where it would be knocked over if the door were to open. He fell asleep listening to an audiobook on his phone, the narrator's calm, steady voice a flimsy shield against the oppressive silence of the house. He woke a few hours later to a sound. A sharp, metallic scraping noise came from downstairs. He sat bolt upright in bed, his ears straining in the darkness. Silence. He held his breath, waiting. Maybe he'd dreamed it. Then it came again. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It was the sound of something metal being dragged across the wooden floor of the living room. His blood ran cold. The chair was still wedged under his doorknob. His boot was still on the floor. Whoever was making that noise was already inside the house. His mind raced. His phone was on the bed beside him. Should he call 911? What would he say? I think I hear a noise? They'd take forever to get out here if they came at all. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. Shouting for help was useless. He slipped out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He crept to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. He He could hear it more clearly now. A slow, rhythmic dragging sound. It was moving. It seemed to be coming from the dining room, then moving towards the front of the house. He thought of his car keys, sitting in the pocket of his jeans on the floor. His car was his only way out. Then the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise itself. He waited, every muscle in his body tensed. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He heard a floorboard creak directly below him, then another. Someone was walking, slowly and deliberately, through the downstairs rooms. He backed away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked wildly around the dark room for a weapon. The only thing he could think of was the heavy maglite flashlight in his duffel bag. He fumbled for it in the dark, his fingers closing around its cold, metal body. He switched it on, the bright beam cutting a clean circle on the far wall. He stood in the middle of the room, flashlight held in a white-knuckled grip, for what felt like hours. The house remained silent. The walking had stopped. There were no more sounds. Had he imagined it all? Was this old, creaky house playing tricks on his sleep-deprived mind? Eventually, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. Bolstered by the growing light, he worked up the courage to move. He slowly, silently, removed the chair from under the doorknob. He picked up his boot. He took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pulled the door open. He shone the flashlight down the dark hallway, then down the stairs. Nothing. Everything looked exactly as he had left it. He crept down the stairs, his bare feet making no sound on the wood. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the living room. The faded sofa, the dusty end tables, nothing out of place. He moved into the dining room, the heavy table, the mismatched chairs. He shined the light on the floor, looking for footprints, for any sign of an intruder. He saw nothing but dust. Then he noticed the dining table. He had specifically noted its position yesterday, how one of its heavy legs was resting on a slightly warped floorboard. He had thought about moving it. He looked closer. The table had been moved. Not by much, maybe 6 inches, dragged sideways. On the floor, he could now see 4 long, deep scratches in the old hardwood. The raw, pale wood exposed beneath the dark finish. That was the scraping sound. Someone had been in the house, and they had dragged the heavy dining table across the floor. Why? To what end? It was a senseless, bizarre act. He checked the front door. The deadbolt was still locked. He went to the back door in the kitchen, also locked. He rechecked all the downstairs windows. Every single one was locked from the inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, the latches stiff. There was no sign of a forced entry. No broken glass, no pry marks on the frames. It was impossible, but the scratches on the floor were real. The proof was right there, gouged into the wood. He felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of profound disorientation, as if the fundamental laws of reality were being warped around him. He leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was no longer just unsettling. It was hostile, and he was trapped in it. Caleb stumbled back to the kitchen and braced his hands on the rust-stained sink, splashing the cold, sulfur-scented water on his face. He had to think. He was a scientist. He dealt in facts, in evidence. Fact 1. The table was moved. Fact 2. The doors and windows were locked from the inside. These 2 facts could not coexist. Therefore, one of his observations must be wrong. Either the table wasn't moved, a delusion brought on by stress, or the house was not secure. The deep, raw scratches in the floor were undeniable. So, the house was not secure. He spent the next hour conducting a systematic, top-to-bottom search. He was a surveyor. His entire profession was about understanding a piece of land, its boundaries, its hidden contours. He would apply the same methodology to this house. He started in the attic, a cramped, triangular space accessible through a hatch in the upstairs hallway ceiling. It was thick with dust and cobwebs that clung to his hair and clothes. It was suffocatingly hot and smelled of baked wood and dead insects. There were no windows, and the eaves were tightly sealed. No one could get in or out through here. Next, the downstairs. He re-examined every window, running his fingers along the frames, pushing against the glass. They were solid, old but solid. He checked the fireplace in the living room. The flue was rusted shut, choked with a generation's worth of soot and debris. He pushed on the walls, knocking on the plaster, listening for hollow spots that might indicate a hidden panel, feeling like a character in a Gothic novel. The idea was absurd, but less absurd than an intruder who could walk through walls. It was in the kitchen that he found it. Tucked away in a corner, mostly obscured by the hulking, ancient refrigerator, was a low door he hadn't noticed before. It was short, maybe 4 feet high, and painted the same pale yellow as the walls, making it easy to overlook. A simple hook and eye latch held it closed. He pulled the refrigerator away from the wall with a loud scraping groan, revealing the whole door. It led, he presumed, to a cellar or a crawl space. His heart hammered. This had to be it. He fumbled with the rusted hook, his fingers slick with sweat. Came free with a screech. He pulled the small door open. A wave of cool, damp air washed over him, carrying a heavy odor of wet earth and decay. He shone his flashlight into the opening. A set of steep, rickety wooden steps led down into blackness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and weak. The only answer was the faint dripping of water somewhere in the dark. He hesitated for only a moment before descending, one hand on the damp stone wall for support, the other holding the flashlight beam steady. The cellar was small, with a packed dirt floor. The stone foundation walls were slick with moisture. A few rotting wooden shelves lined one wall, holding empty glass jars thick with grime. In the center of the floor was the well pump, a modern-looking submersible unit, which explained the clanking he'd heard. He swept the light across the entire space, into every corner. There were no other doors, no windows, no hatches leading outside. It was a sealed stone box, a dead end. Defeated, he climbed back up the steps, his mind reeling. He secured the cellar door with its hook and shoved the refrigerator back into place. There was no way in, and yet there was. He was late for work. He skipped breakfast, grabbed his gear from the car, and sped towards the site, his mind a frantic mess of impossible calculations. The mundane reality of the job was a jarring contrast to the madness of the house. Brenda was already there, looking at her watch. "Everything all right, Caleb?" she asked, her eyes sharp. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "No, just didn't sleep well," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "Old house, lots of creaks." "Tell me about it," she said, though her expression suggested she didn't quite believe him. "I rented a cabin near Laurelville my first year on this project. Swore I heard banjos playing in the woods all night. It's just the trees and the wind. This area gets in your head if you let it." He tried to focus on his work, on the precise art of mapping contamination plumes. He took soil samples, bagging and labeling them with meticulous care. But his focus kept slipping. Every snap of a twig in the surrounding woods made him jump. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. He thought again about the child's rocking chair in the shed, so strangely clean. The image sent a fresh wave of dread through him. During his lunch break, sitting in the cab of his Civic, he decided to call the landlord. He had to know more about this house. He found Mr. Abernathy's number and dialed. It rang 6 times before the man picked up. "Yeah." The voice was as gravelly as he remembered. "Mr. Abernathy? It's Caleb Thorne. The tenant at your house on County Road 21. What is it? Something broken?" "No, not exactly. I just have a few questions about the house. It's very old, and I was wondering about its history, and its security." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "It's a house. People lived in it. Now you live in it. As for security, you've got a key and a lock. Use them." "Right, but last night, I think someone may have been inside the house," Caleb said, the words tumbling out. "I found things moved this morning. A heavy table was dragged across the floor." Abernathy let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like rocks in a tumbler. "Son, nobody was in your house. I've owned that property for 20 years. You know how many times I've heard that? The place settles. The wind howls through the floorboards. It makes noises. You city boys come out here and you're not used to the quiet. Your imagination starts running away with you. Latch your doors and get some sleep. But the scratches on the floor. Look, you wanted a cheap place, you got a cheap place. Comes with character. If you can't handle it, the highway runs both ways. But I've got your deposit and first month's rent, and the contract is for 6 months. Now, I'm a busy man. Don't call me again unless the well runs dry or the roof caves in. The line went dead. Caleb stared at his phone, a cold fury mixing with his fear. He wasn't imagining it. He was being gaslit by a landlord who couldn't be bothered. He was completely on his own. That evening, he didn't go back to the house immediately. He drove to a hardware store in Logan. He bought 2 heavy-duty barrel bolts for the front and back doors. He bought a motion-activated security light for the front porch. And, on an impulse, he bought a cheap digital camera, the kind used by hunters to track game, that would take a picture whenever it detected movement. He would gather his own evidence. He would prove he wasn't crazy. He spent the next hour installing his new security measures. He screwed the thick steel bolts into the old wood of the doors, the physical act of reinforcing his sanctuary providing a small measure of comfort. He installed the motion-activated light above the front porch, aiming it at the yard. Finally, he set up the game camera. He didn't want to put it somewhere obvious. He decided to place it inside the house, on top of a tall, dusty bookshelf in the living room, aimed directly at the dining room and the scratched section of floor. He checked the angle, made sure the motion sensor was active, and felt a grim sense of satisfaction. If someone came in tonight and so much as breathed on that table, he would have their picture. He barricaded his bedroom door as usual, with the chair and the boot. Exhausted by the physical and emotional toll of the last 48 hours, he fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep almost immediately. The next morning, he woke to the sun streaming through his window. The house was still. The chair was still wedged under the knob. The boot was untouched. A sliver of hope entered his mind. Maybe the new locks had worked. Maybe the perpetrator had seen the new motion light and been scared off. He went downstairs. The barrel bolt on the front door was still secure. The one on the back door was too. He walked into the living room, his eyes immediately going to the dining table. It was exactly where it had been. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made him weak in the knees. It was over. He had secured the house. Then he looked up at the bookshelf. The game camera was gone. He stared at the empty space where it had been, his blood turning to ice. He scanned the room, thinking it might have fallen. It hadn't. It was simply gone. He rushed to the front door, his hands trembling as he slid the bolt and unlocked the deadbolt. He stepped out onto the porch. The motion-activated light he had installed was also gone. Not just the bulb, the entire fixture. The wires he had connected were snipped clean, hanging uselessly from the porch ceiling. There were no footprints in the damp soil of the yard, no sign of anything. Someone had not only gotten into his locked and bolted house, they had walked through the rooms while he slept upstairs. They had seen his camera, understood what it was for, and taken it. They had gone outside and dismantled his security light. It wasn't random. It was a direct response to his actions. It was a message. I can get in whenever I want. I can take whatever I want. And you can't stop me. You're not the one watching. I am. Caleb felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic. This was no longer about strange noises or unsettling feelings. This was a direct, calculated violation. He was being toyed with. The perpetrator wasn't just an intruder. They were an audience, and he was the unwilling star of a one-man show. His first instinct was to pack his bags and leave. Drive back to Columbus, sleep on his sister's couch, and never look back. Let Abernathy keep the deposit. No job was worth this. He actually took a step toward the stairs, his mind already calculating how quickly he could throw his belongings into his car. But then a different feeling took root, pushing back against the fear. Anger. A hot, stubborn rage. Who was doing this? And why? It was the why that gnawed at him. There was no logic to it. His wallet, his laptop, his expensive surveying equipment left untouched in his car. Nothing of value was ever taken, except for the things he used to try and see his tormentor. He wasn't going to be run out of his own house by some creep playing mind games. This was his space, temporary as it was. He was paying for it. The anger solidified into a cold resolve. He was a surveyor. His job was to find what was hidden beneath the surface. He would do the same thing here. He would turn this house inside out until it gave up its secrets. He drove to work in a state of hypervigilance, his eyes scanning the roadsides, the other cars, the faces of people in the town. Everyone was a suspect. The friendly cashier at the gas station, the old man tending his garden, the teenager on a bicycle. Any one of them could be the one who walked silently through his house at night. It was a dizzying, paranoid way to see the world. At the worksite, Brenda gave him a strange look. "Caleb, you really need to get some rest. You're white as a sheet." "I'm fine," he lied, his voice tight. "Just focused." He couldn't focus. He kept replaying the events in his head, searching for a missed detail, a flaw in the intruder's methods. The locks. He kept coming back to the locks. A skilled lockpick? Possible, but to pick 2 deadbolts and 2 new barrel bolts without leaving a single scratch or sound. It seemed unlikely. A key? Only he and the landlord in Cleveland supposedly had one. What if Abernathy had lied? What if he'd given a key to someone else? A caretaker? A relative? He decided to do some research on his landlord. During his lunch break, he sat in his car and Googled Mr. Abernathy, Cleveland, Ohio, real estate. He got a few hits for a property management company, but the name was common. He refined the search, adding Hocking Hills and Logan. A few more links appeared, mostly public records of property transfers. He found the deed for his rental house. It was indeed owned by a holding company registered to a Thomas Abernathy in Cleveland. He also found records of Abernathy buying and selling several other distressed properties in rural Ohio counties over the years. He was a speculator, buying cheap, isolated parcels and likely renting them out with minimal upkeep until he could sell them for a profit. Then he stumbled upon something else. A link to a local news blog from a town in a neighboring county, dated 3 years earlier. The headline read, "Family Flees, Haunted Rental, Cites Landlord Negligence." The story detailed the experience of a family with 2 young children who had rented a remote farmhouse, also owned by Thomas Abernathy. They reported terrifying events. Objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing, and the distinct feeling of being watched. They had broken their lease and left in the middle of the night. Abernathy was quoted in the article, giving almost the exact same speech he'd given Caleb. "It's an old house. They have overactive imaginations." Caleb's blood ran cold. This wasn't the first time. Abernathy knew this was happening and was knowingly putting tenants in this situation. But why? Was it some sick form of entertainment for him? Or was he covering for someone? That night, Caleb changed his tactics. He didn't bother with new locks or cameras. He knew they would just be removed. Instead, he decided to create a series of silent, low-tech alarms. He took a spool of black thread from a small sewing kit his mother had given him and stretched it taut across the bottom of the cellar door, securing it with thumbtacks. He did the same across the bottom of the front and back doors, about 2 inches off the floor. Then he went into the dining room. He sprinkled a fine, even layer of flour on the floor in a wide circle around the dining table, the one that had been moved. Any footstep would leave a clear print. Upstairs, he did not barricade his door. He left it unlocked and slightly ajar. He wanted to appear complacent, to lure the intruder into a sense of security. He sat in the rickety chair in the corner of his room, the heavy Maglite flashlight resting in his lap, and he waited. He was dressed in jeans and a dark sweatshirt. The house was utterly dark. He had turned off every light. He sat in the silent, oppressive blackness, his senses on high alert. He was hunting now. The hours ticked by. The house made its usual symphony of groans and creaks. A branch scraped against a window. The refrigerator downstairs cycled on with a hum. Caleb remained motionless, his breathing slow and even. He fought off waves of drowsiness, pinching his own leg to stay awake. It was sometime after 2 in the morning when he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound from downstairs. A soft click. It was the sound of the ancient hook-and-eye latch on the cellar door being lifted. Caleb's entire body went rigid. Adrenaline surged through him, sharp and electric. He didn't move. He listened. He heard the faint creak of the cellar door opening. Then silence. A long, drawn-out silence. He strained to hear footsteps, but there was nothing. It was as if a ghost had emerged from the cellar. But he knew it wasn't a ghost. A ghost wouldn't need to unlatch a door. He waited. 1 minute, 2, 5. Then he heard another sound. A soft, shuffling noise. It was coming from the kitchen, moving toward the dining room. He gripped the flashlight, his knuckles white. The shuffling stopped. He imagined the figure standing on the edge of the flour-dusted floor, perhaps sensing the trap. Then he heard the faintest whisper of movement, a sound like cloth brushing against wood. It was in the dining room now. A floorboard beneath the intruder's weight let out a low, mournful groan. Caleb stood up, his own movements completely silent. He crept out of his bedroom and into the pitch-black hallway. He moved to the top of the stairs, every nerve ending screaming. He could hear the person moving around downstairs now, still with that same uncanny quietness, but their presence was undeniable. A soft bump, as if they'd brushed against the table. A rustle of clothing. Caleb started down the stairs, placing his feet carefully on the very edge of each step to minimize the creaking. He descended into the inky blackness of the ground floor, the flashlight held up like a weapon. He reached the bottom of the staircase and paused, pressing himself against the wall. The living room was to his left, the dining room straight ahead. The shuffling sounds were coming from the dining room. He took a deep, silent breath, rounded the corner of the wall, raised the mag light, and thumbed the switch. The beam of light shot out, blindingly bright in the total darkness, cut a perfect, stark circle. In the center of that circle, standing next to the dining table, was a man. He was old, perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, painfully thin and wiry. He was dressed in a strange assortment of clothing, dark, patched trousers, a tattered flannel shirt, and a heavy wool coat, despite the humid night. His face was a mask of wrinkles, dominated by pale, watery eyes that blinked owlishly in the sudden glare. His white hair was thin and wispy, and a scraggly beard covered his jaw. In his hand, he held a feather duster. Caleb stared, dumbfounded. This was his nocturnal tormentor? This frail, elderly man? The man didn't seem scared or surprised. He simply stood there, frozen in the beam of light, one hand resting gently on the dining table. He looked less like a malevolent intruder and more like a confused ghost. "Who are you?" Caleb demanded, his voice a harsh croak. "What are you doing in my house?" The old man blinked slowly. He didn't speak. He just looked at Caleb, and then his gaze drifted around the room, as if trying to place it. "I said, who are you?" Caleb repeated, taking a step forward. He could see the flour on the floor now. A single set of tracks, made by worn-out work boots, led from the kitchen to where the man was standing. The old man finally looked back at Caleb. His lips parted, and he spoke, his voice a dry, reedy whisper. "I need to dust," he said, as if it were the most reasonable explanation in the world. "She doesn't like the dust." Caleb's anger and fear coalesced into a profound, disorienting confusion. The man's response was so utterly disconnected from the reality of the situation that it short-circuited Caleb's own adrenaline-fueled readiness for a confrontation. A feather duster. Of all the things he had imagined, a geriatric man obsessed with cleaning was not on the list. "She? Who is she?" Caleb asked, keeping the flashlight beam fixed on the man's face. "There's no one else here." The old man's watery eyes seemed to look past Caleb, toward the darkened living room. "My wife," he whispered, a hint of reverence in his tone. "Eleanor. She keeps a tidy house. Always has." The name hung in the air. Eleanor. This was a new variable, one that made no sense. "There's no Eleanor here," Caleb said, his voice firm but laced with a dawning, unsettling pity. "You're in the wrong house." You have to leave. The man flinched at Caleb's tone, pulling his threadbare coat tighter around his thin frame. No, he said, shaking his head slowly. This is my house. I built the back porch with my own 2 hands. Eleanor planted the rose bushes by the front steps. We've been here 47 years. His gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time he seemed to notice the flower. He looked at the white powder clinging to his boots with a sort of mild, detached curiosity. A chilling realization began to creep into Caleb's mind. The man wasn't a malicious prankster. He was deeply, profoundly confused. He likely suffered from dementia or some other cognitive decline. He wasn't breaking in. In his mind, he was simply coming home. "What's your name?" Caleb asked, softening his voice. "Joseph," the man said quietly. "Joseph Bell." This must be the neighbor Abernathy had mentioned, the one a quarter-mile down the road. "Joseph," Caleb said, taking a slow step closer. "This house was sold. You don't live here anymore. My name is Caleb. I'm renting it for a few months." Joseph Bell looked at him, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and fear. "Sold? No, Thomas wouldn't do that. Thomas Abernathy. He's a good boy. Helps me with the taxes." The landlord, Abernathy, was connected to this man. The pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. Abernathy hadn't just bought a random distressed property. He had likely bought it directly from this man, Joseph, probably for a pittance, taking advantage of his confused state. And he knew Joseph was still coming back to the house. The stories from the other tenants, the gaslighting on the phone. Abernathy wasn't just a negligent landlord. He was actively concealing this situation, renting out a property he knew was regularly visited by its former, mentally unwell owner. It was cruel and deeply dangerous. "Joseph, where do you live now?" Caleb asked gently. "I live here," he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. He looked at the dining table. "Eleanor wanted me to move the table. For the sweeping." He gestured with the feather duster. This explained the scratches on the floor. He was just following the perceived instructions of his long-gone wife, performing a phantom version of his daily chores. "Where did you come from just now?" Caleb asked, pointing the flashlight toward the kitchen. "From the cellar?" Joseph nodded. "The new door is sticky," he said, as if referring to the front door. "I used the old way." Caleb's mind raced. The old way. There had to be another entrance to the cellar. He had searched, but he could have missed something. "Can you show me?" Joseph seemed to shrink back, intimidated by the request. "It's late. Eleanor will worry." "It's okay, Joseph. I just need to see." "For safety," Caleb said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. He lowered the flashlight beam so it wasn't shining directly in the man's eyes. Hesitantly, Joseph shuffled toward the kitchen, and Caleb followed. He led him to the small cellar door and pointed. "Down there." Caleb gestured for Joseph to go first. The old man navigated the steep steps with a familiarity that spoke of decades of use. Caleb followed, his flashlight beam illuminating the damp stone walls. Once at the bottom, on the packed dirt floor, Joseph walked to the far wall, the one Caleb had examined and dismissed as solid foundation. He reached out and pressed on a specific, unremarkable-looking stone about 3 feet from the floor. With a low, grinding sound, a section of the stone wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. Caleb stared in disbelief. It was a perfectly concealed door, the seams masked by mortar and age. The tunnel beyond was low and dark, shored up with thick, rotting timbers. It smelled of damp soil and roots. Tunnel. That's how he got in. Not through locks or windows, but from underground. "Where does this go, Joseph?" Caleb asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Home," Joseph said simply. He took a step into the tunnel. "Wait," Caleb said, putting a hand on the man's arm. "You can't stay here. This isn't your house anymore. It isn't safe for you to be wandering around at night." Joseph pulled his arm away, a flicker of agitation in his pale eyes. "This is my home. You are the one who is trespassing." He turned and, with a surprising quickness, disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. Caleb stood frozen at the tunnel's entrance, the beam of his flashlight cutting a weak path into the suffocating blackness. Should he follow him? Try to bring him back? He had no idea where the tunnel led. Could be unstable. He was in no way equipped to venture into an unknown underground passage. He called out, "Joseph!" But the only reply was the echoing of his own voice. He backed out of the cellar, his mind reeling. He swung the heavy stone door shut. It locked into place with a solid thud, and climbed the stairs back into the kitchen. The immediate threat was gone, but the situation had become infinitely more complicated and sad. His phantom intruder was a sick old man, and he was living in the middle of a tragedy orchestrated by a predatory landlord. He looked at the flower on the dining room floor, at the single set of footprints. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion and guilt. He had been terrified of this man, had set traps for him. He went and found a dustpan and broom and carefully swept up the flower, erasing the evidence of his own fear. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee he didn't taste, and watched the sun come up. He now had a choice to make. He could call the police or adult protective services. Joseph was clearly a vulnerable adult who needed help. But that would involve explaining the tunnel, the landlord, the whole bizarre situation. It would become a bureaucratic nightmare, and he'd be right in the middle of it. Or he could pack his car, leave, and pretend none of this ever happened. Drive away and let Abernathy deal with the fallout when the next tenant inevitably called him, terrified, in the middle of the night. But the image of Joseph's confused, watery eyes stuck with him. He couldn't just leave him to wander through a dark tunnel, a ghost in his own memories. The next morning, he called in sick to work. He told Brenda he had a stomach bug, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. Then he set out to find where the tunnel ended. He couldn't risk going through it, so he would have to find the other end from the surface. A quarter-mile down the road, Abernathy had said. He got in his Civic and drove slowly down County Road 21, the way he had come on his first day. He passed his own driveway, then counted the distance on his odometer. At almost exactly a quarter of a mile, there was another driveway even more overgrown than his own. It was barely visible, a faint parting in the dense wall of trees and bushes. He parked on the shoulder of the road and got out. A rusted, leaning mailbox stood half-hidden in the weeds. The name on the side was faded but still legible, Bell. Caleb pushed his way through the overgrown branches into the driveway. After about 100 feet, it opened into a clearing. In the center stood a small, derelict-looking house, a one-story ranch that had seen far better days. The windows were boarded up, and a blue tarp was stretched across a section of the roof. This must be where Joseph was living now. It looked abandoned, condemned even. As he got closer, he saw a small, weathered shed off to the side, its door slightly ajar. It looked almost identical to the shed on his rental property. He walked toward it, a sense of dread growing in his stomach. He peeked inside. It was mostly empty, save for some gardening tools and empty bags of fertilizer. And against the back wall, a dark opening in the dirt floor, the other end of the tunnel. He backed away from the shed and turned his attention back to the house. It was quiet. He walked up to the front door and knocked. "Joseph?" "It's Caleb from next door. Are you in there?" There was no answer. He tried the knob. It was locked. He walked around the house, peering through gaps in the boards covering the windows. The inside was dark and filled with cluttered shapes. It looked more like a hoarder's den than a home. It was hard to believe anyone could live in such conditions. He was about to give up and leave when he heard a faint sound from the back of the house. A low, rhythmic creaking. He followed the sound to the back porch. There, sitting in a simple wooden rocking chair, was Joseph Bell. He was staring out at the woods, rocking back and forth slowly, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't seem to have noticed Caleb at all. Caleb stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do or say. The man looked so frail, so lost in his own world. This was so much bigger than a scary story about a strange house. This was a man who had fallen through the cracks, abandoned to live in a ruin, while a predator profited from his former life. Caleb knew then that he couldn't walk away. He had stumbled into Joseph Bell's life, and now, for better or worse, he was a part of it. He had to do something. He just had no idea what. Caleb took a tentative step onto the rotting wood of the back porch. The creaking of the rocking chair stopped. Joseph Bell turned his head slowly, his pale eyes fixing on Caleb with a look not of surprise, but of weary recognition. "The young man," Joseph said, his voice a dry rustle. "From Eleanor's house." "That's right," Caleb replied, keeping his distance. "I was worried about you, Joseph, after last night." Joseph's gaze drifted back towards the impassive wall of trees. "She was fretful, said there was a stranger in the house. I told her you seemed like a nice boy." He spoke of his wife as if she were in the next room, her presence as real to him as the splintering floorboards beneath his feet. The depth of his delusion was heartbreaking. "Joseph, the house you're living in, is it safe? Do you have food? Running water?" Caleb asked, glancing at the boarded-up windows and the general state of decay. "Of course," Joseph said with a flicker of indignation. "Eleanor is a fine cook. We have a well." He patted the arm of his rocking chair. "Everything we need." Caleb knew he couldn't argue. He was trying to apply logic to a mind that no longer adhered to its rules. He needed a different approach. He had to get another human being involved, someone who could properly assess the situation. Calling the police in this rural area felt risky. He could imagine a deputy showing up and escalating the situation with the confused old man. Adult Protective Services seemed like the right path, but he didn't know how long that would take. He needed to handle the immediate problem, the tunnel. He couldn't have Joseph wandering into his house every night. It was dangerous for both of them. "Joseph," Caleb began carefully, "the tunnel between the houses, it's very old. I'm a geologist, a surveyor. I know about the ground. I'm worried it might collapse. It's not safe for you to use." A flicker of anxiety crossed Joseph's face. "It's always been safe. My father and I dug it. During the war scare, people were building shelters." He looked down at his own gnarled hands. "Good, solid work. I know, but time changes things. The soil shifts, the wood rots. I need to seal it up just to be safe. I can't have you getting hurt." "No," Joseph said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You can't. That's my way home." "This is your home, Joseph," Caleb said, gesturing to the dilapidated house around them. "This is where you live now." "No!" Joseph stood up, his wiry frame trembling with agitation. This is temporary. The house is being painted. We're staying here until the fumes are gone. Eleanor is sensitive to the fumes." He was creating a new narrative on the spot, his mind desperately patching the holes in his reality. "You can't close the tunnel. I have to get back to her." Caleb saw the panic in his eyes and knew he couldn't push it. Forcing the issue now would only make Joseph fearful of him, and he might be the only person looking out for the man. He had to find another way. He retreated, offering a placating, "Okay, Joseph, we'll talk about it later," and backed away. He returned to his car, his mind a storm of conflicting duties. His responsibility to his own safety versus his newfound, unwilling responsibility for this stranger. He drove into Logan and found a small public library. He used their computer to look up the Hocking County branch of Adult Protective Services. He found a number and a generic email address. He chose to write an email, wanting to lay out the complex situation clearly and create a paper trail. He described the situation as factually as he could. An elderly man, Joseph Bell, living in unsafe conditions. A landlord, Thomas Abernathy, who was aware of the situation. He mentioned Joseph's confusion and his belief that he still lived in the rental house. He described the nightly visits but made a crucial omission. He did not mention the tunnel. He couldn't think of a way to describe a secret passage from a cellar without sounding like he was the one who was delusional. He worried it would discredit his entire report. He simply stated that Joseph was able to gain access to the locked house and left it at that. He gave both addresses, his own contact information, and pressed send. An automated reply informed him that his case would be reviewed and someone would contact him within 5 to 7 business days. A week. A week was an eternity. He drove back to his rental house feeling defeated. He had to find a way to secure the cellar. He couldn't collapse the tunnel, but he could block his end of it. He went down into the cellar, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He swung open the heavy stone door and stared into the blackness of the passage. He couldn't seal it permanently without trapping Joseph, but he needed a barrier. He looked around the cellar. The rotting wooden shelves gave him an idea. They were held up by heavy, termite-eaten beams. He found one that was loose, and with some effort he pried it free. It was a solid piece of timber, about 4 feet long and heavy. He dragged it to the tunnel entrance. It was too long to fit across the opening on the inside, but he could wedge it against the stone door from the cellar side. He swung the stone door shut and propped the thick beam against it at an angle, wedging the other end into the hard-packed dirt of the floor. It wasn't perfect, but it would be heavy and awkward to move from the other side. It would make noise. It would, at the very least, wake him up. That night, for the first time, he felt a different kind of dread. Not the fear of a malevolent, unknown intruder, but the sad, heavy anxiety of waiting for a confused old man to stumble into his trap. He left the lights on downstairs, hoping it might deter Joseph, make the house feel unfamiliar to him. He went to bed but didn't sleep, listening for the telltale scrape of wood against stone from the cellar. The night passed in silence. No sounds came from the cellar. No one tried to open the stone door. Caleb woke the next morning feeling a small measure of relief. Maybe the lights had worked. Maybe Joseph had stayed in his own house. He spent the day at work, the physical labor a welcome distraction. He felt a sliver of hope that perhaps the situation was contained, that he could hold out until APS responded. But when he returned to the house that evening, the hope vanished. Tucked under the windshield wiper of his Honda Civic was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a page torn from a child's lined notebook, yellowed with age. He unfolded it. Written in a shaky, spidery script were 3 words. "You moved my chair." Caleb's heart sank. It was from Joseph. He had come onto the property while Caleb was at work. He had been looking for something. He looked toward the dilapidated shed in the backyard. He walked over, his boots sinking into the damp soil, and peered inside. The small, pale blue child's rocking chair was gone. Joseph hadn't tried to get into the house. He had come for the chair. The clean chair. Why was it so important to him? Was it something for Eleanor? A memory of a child they'd had? The note was not threatening, but it was a clear sign that Joseph's world and Caleb's were still intertwined. He was still coming here, still walking the grounds of his former life, noticing every little thing that was out of place. Caleb looked from the empty shed to the dark tree line at the edge of the property. He thought of Joseph, alone in that ruined house down the road, clutching a small, blue rocking chair. The man wasn't a threat, but the situation was. It was a powder keg of dementia, neglect, and predatory real estate practices, and Caleb was sitting right on top of it. He checked his email on his phone. There was still no response from Adult Protective Services. He was still on his own. That night, he felt a new kind of unease. He wasn't worried about Joseph getting in. He was worried about him being out. He found himself listening for sounds outside the house, for the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves that might signal the old man was wandering the property in the dark. Sometime around midnight, he was startled by a sound from the front of the house. It wasn't a scraping or a footstep. It was a car, the distinct rumble of an engine, coming up his driveway. Caleb scrambled out of bed and crept to the window that overlooked the front yard. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the overgrown lawn before stopping behind his Civic. The engine cut out, plunging the yard back into blackness. A car door opened and closed. Caleb's mind raced. Was it the police? APS? It was too late for a social worker. He couldn't see the vehicle clearly, just its dark shape. A figure got out of the car. It was a man, larger than Joseph, moving with a confident stride. He walked up onto the porch. Caleb's blood ran cold. This was not a lost old man. This was someone else. He heard heavy footsteps on the porch, then a loud, authoritative knock on the front door. "Caleb Thorne!" A voice boomed, deep and unfamiliar. "I know you're in there. This is Mr. Abernathy. We need to have a talk." The landlord's name, spoken with such booming confidence in the dead of night, sent a jolt of ice through Caleb's veins. Abernathy wasn't in Cleveland. He was here, on the porch. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. He must have been alerted somehow. Had Joseph called him? Had he found a way to contact his friend who helped with the taxes? Or had the APS email been forwarded to him? Caleb remained frozen by the upstairs window, his mind a whirlwind. He was paying rent. He had a contract. Abernathy had no right to show up unannounced in the middle of the night. This wasn't a friendly visit. It was an act of intimidation. "Thorne, I'm not going to stand out here all night." Abernathy's voice was sharp, impatient. The heavy fist knocked again, rattling the old door in its frame. Caleb backed away from the window. What were his options? He could ignore him, pretend he wasn't home, but his car was in the driveway and a light was on downstairs. That was a fool's game. He could call the sheriff's department and report a trespasser, but that would ignite a conflict he wasn't prepared for. He decided, reluctantly, that he had to face him. This confrontation was inevitable. He pulled on his jeans and a t-shirt, his hands trembling slightly. He walked down the stairs, each step a conscious, deliberate act. He could see the man's bulky silhouette through the thin curtains of the living room window. He reached the front door, his hand hovering over the barrel bolt and deadbolt he had installed. He took a deep breath, slid the heavy bolt back with a loud clank, and turned the lock. He opened the door just enough to see out, keeping his body braced against it. Thomas Abernathy was a large man, barrel-chested and thick-necked, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes. He was dressed in a polo shirt and slacks that seemed out of place in the rustic setting. He looked like a man who was used to getting his way. "Took you long enough?" Abernathy grunted, his eyes immediately flicking past Caleb to take in the interior of the house. "We need to talk." "It's after midnight, Mr. Abernathy," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Whatever it is, it can wait until morning." "No, it can't," Abernathy said, taking a step forward, forcing Caleb to hold his ground to keep the door from opening further. "I got a very interesting email forwarded to me today, from the county. Seems my tenant has been making some wild accusations, filing reports, causing trouble." So that was it, the APS email. It hadn't gone into a queue. It had gone straight to the person he was reporting. The system wasn't just broken, it was complicit. "I reported a vulnerable adult living in unsafe conditions," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "Joseph Bell. I was concerned for his safety." Abernathy let out a humorless laugh. "You were concerned? You who's been here for 5 minutes. I've known Joe Bell for 20 years. He's fine. He's always been a little eccentric. Likes to wander. It's his land. He can wander if he wants." "It's not his land anymore, is it? You bought it from him, and you put him in that derelict house down the road while you rent this one out, knowing full well he still comes here. Knowing he terrifies your tenants." Abernathy's face darkened. "You don't know anything about my arrangement with Joe. I look out for him. That social worker nonsense you started could get him put in a state home. Is that what you want? For him to be locked up in some miserable ward? He's happy here. He's free." The hypocrisy was staggering. Abernathy was framing his own predatory negligence as a form of kindness. Happy? He's living in a condemned house with no running water and getting into strangers' homes through a secret tunnel in the cellar. Caleb retorted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. He immediately regretted mentioning the tunnel. Abernathy's eyes narrowed, the shrewdness replaced by a cold, hard glare. For a moment he was silent. "So you found that," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You've been snooping around where you don't belong." "I found it because the man you're looking out for was standing in my dining room with a feather duster at 2 in the morning. Caleb shot back. "You need to drop this, Thorne," Abernathy said, his voice a low growl. "You need to withdraw your report and you need to mind your own business for the next 6 months. Joe's not hurting anyone. He's a harmless old man. You leave him alone, and you leave me alone. Understand?" The threat hung in the air, thick and palpable. This was no longer about a confused old man. It was about Abernathy protecting his profitable, unethical setup. He wasn't just a landlord. He was a gatekeeper, and Caleb had just tried to storm the gate. "And if I don't?" Caleb asked, a surge of defiant anger overriding his fear. Abernathy smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a 6-month contract, but contracts can be terminated. You're on private property. If I say you're trespassing, the sheriff will be here to escort you off it. Your things will be put on the curb. You'll be out a place to live and a place to work because I will be having a word with your project manager about what a disruptive influence you are. Brenda's a friend of mine. Hocking Hills is a small place. A bad reputation sticks." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. The threat was comprehensive. His home, his job, his reputation. Abernathy had considered all the angles. He had him cornered. "Now," Abernathy said, his voice returning to its booming, authoritative tone, "I'm going to go have a word with Joe. Make sure you haven't upset him too much. When I get back, I expect you to have sent another email to the county, telling them you made a mistake, that you overreacted, that the situation is resolved. Am I clear?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, walked off the porch with the heavy tread of a man who owned the ground he walked on, got back in his car, and drove down the driveway, his taillights disappearing into the oppressive darkness. Caleb was left standing in the open doorway, the humid night air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and menace. He was trapped. If he pushed forward, he risked everything, his job, his immediate financial stability. If he backed down, he would be abandoning Joseph to a man who was clearly exploiting him, and he would have to live in this house for 6 months, knowing that Abernathy could and would make his life a living hell at any moment. He closed and locked the door, his hands shaking with fury. He walked into the living room and sank onto the dusty, floral print sofa, his head in his hands. The house, which had once felt haunted by a mysterious presence, now felt haunted by something far more tangible and terrifying. The banal, ruthless cruelty of a powerful man. The scraping noises and moving furniture were nothing compared to the cold, calculated threat he had just faced on his own porch. He looked around the dark, silent room. He thought about the family who had fled this house in the middle of the night. He understood now. They weren't running from a ghost. They were running from Abernathy. He knew he couldn't stay. It wasn't safe. Not from Joseph, but from the man who held the deed. But he also couldn't just run. Abernathy's threats about his job were real. He had to be smart. He needed proof. He needed leverage. The thought that had been a flicker of paranoia before now became a blazing certainty. He was not just a tenant. He was a witness. And Abernathy knew it. The game had changed. It wasn't about securing the house anymore. It was about surviving the landlord. Sleep was impossible. Caleb sat on the sofa as the minutes bled into hours, Abernathy's threats echoing in the silent house. The landlord's confidence was the most chilling part. He wasn't afraid of being exposed because he had insulated himself, weaving his influence into the fabric of the small community. He knew the project manager. He had connections at the county. He operated in the open, confident that his power and the isolation of his victims would protect him. Caleb felt a grim resolve hardening in his gut. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to send a retraction email and spend the next 6 months looking over his shoulder. But he couldn't fight Abernathy head-on. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, a plan began to form, a plan born of his own profession. He was a surveyor. He dealt in evidence, in mapping what was unseen, in creating an undeniable record of fact. He would do that here. He would survey Thomas Abernathy. His first move was strategic retreat. He had to create the illusion of compliance. He went to his laptop and, with a bitter taste in his mouth, drafted an email to the APS general address. He kept it brief and vague. To whom it may concern, regarding my previous report on Joseph Bell. After speaking with the property owner, I have a better understanding of the situation. I believe I may have overreacted. Please disregard my earlier submission. The matter is being handled privately. He hit send, feeling a pang of guilt, but knowing it was a necessary deception to buy himself time. Next, he called his sister, Elara. He hadn't told her the full extent of the strangeness, wanting to shield her from worry, but he needed an ally now, someone outside the claustrophobic bubble of Hocking Hills. I'm in some trouble, he said the moment she picked up. He told her everything. The moving table, the game camera, Joseph Bell, the tunnel, and Abernathy's midnight visit. He laid out the threats to his job and housing. "Get out of there, Cal," she said, her voice tight with panic. "Just pack your car and come home. To hell with the job. We'll figure it out." "I can't," he said. "If I just run, he wins. He's doing this to a vulnerable old man, and he's gotten away with it for years. I have the chance to expose him, but if I just disappear, my story has no credibility. I need to gather proof." "Proof of what? That your landlord is a jerk? That's not illegal." "No, but elder abuse is. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is. He bought this house from a man with dementia, stuck him in a hovel, and is collecting rent on his former home while knowing the man is a danger to himself and others. There's a crime here, Elara. I just need to be able to prove it." He could hear her taking a deep breath on the other end of the line. Okay, surveyor. How do you map this?" "I need documents. The original deed transfer for this house. I need to see what Abernathy paid Joseph for it. I need to find out more about Joseph's family. Did he have kids? Relatives who should be looking out for him? And I need to document Joseph's living conditions and his mental state without being intrusive. The county recorder's office should have the property records," Elara, a paralegal, said, immediately shifting into problem-solving mode. "They're public documents. I can look them up online from here. What's the parcel number?" Caleb found an old tax bill in a kitchen drawer and read her the number. "While you do that," he said, "I'm going to try and talk to Joseph again, gently. Maybe I can find out if he has any other family." After the call, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He drove back to Joseph's dilapidated house, parking once again on the road and walking in. He brought a peace offering, a thermos of hot coffee and a bag of fresh donuts from a shop in town. He found Joseph in the same spot as the day before, sitting on the back porch, though today he was not in the rocking chair. He was hunched over a small wooden table, meticulously cleaning the parts of a disassembled shotgun. The sight sent a fresh jolt of alarm through Caleb. The gun was old, a single-barrel break action, but it looked functional. Joseph looked up as Caleb approached, his eyes wary. "Morning, Joseph," Caleb said, holding up the bag and thermos. "I brought some coffee and donuts." Joseph eyed the offering for a moment before giving a slight nod. Caleb set them down on the table, far from the gun parts. He sat on the top step of the porch, creating a comfortable distance. "Eleanor used to love the ones with the pink frosting," Joseph said quietly, his eyes distant. He picked up a glazed donut, ignoring the coffee. "Joseph, I wanted to ask you about your family," Caleb said after a moment of silence. "Do you and Eleanor have any children?" Joseph's hands stilled. He stared down at the donut in his hands for a long time. "We had a boy," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of insects. "Michael. He was a good boy, looked just like his mother." "Where is Michael now?" Caleb asked gently. "Gone," Joseph whispered. "There was an accident. The quarry. When he was 16. A long time ago." He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a profound, ancient grief that seemed to momentarily cut through the fog of his confusion. "Eleanor. She was never the same after that. The house got too quiet. The story was like a punch to the gut." Caleb suddenly understood the child-sized rocking chair, the mentions of a boy. Joseph wasn't just haunted by the ghost of his wife. He was haunted by the ghost of his son. The quietness of the house was a palpable entity to him, a reminder of his loss. I'm so sorry, Joseph, Caleb said. Joseph just nodded, lost in the memory. He picked up a patch of cloth and a bottle of cleaning solvent and resumed his methodical work on the gun. The conversation about family was over. Caleb left a short time later, the encounter having given him more questions than answers. The tragedy of Joseph's life made Abernathy's actions seem even more monstrous. He had preyed on a man hollowed out by grief. When he got back to his car, he had a text from Alara. Got it. You are not going to believe this. Call me. He dialed her number immediately. What did you find? I found the deed transfer from Joseph Bell to Abernathy's holding company 8 years ago, she said, her voice tight with anger. Cal, he didn't buy it. What do you mean? It was a quitclaim deed. Joseph signed the house over to him. The price listed on the transfer is $1. And I can tell you from the signature, which I had to compare to an older document to even verify, that it was the scrawl of someone either very ill or otherwise incapacitated. $1. Abernathy hadn't bought the house. He had coerced a grieving, confused man into giving it to him for a single dollar. It gets worse, Alara continued. I started digging into Abernathy's company. He owns 12 other properties in rural counties, all acquired the same way. Quitclaim deeds from elderly owners, many of whom are now deceased. He's a predator, Cal. This is his business model. He finds elderly people with no close relatives, gains their trust, and gets them to sign over their property. Then he rents it out or waits for them to die so he can sell it with a clean title. The scope of it, the cold, systematic evil of it, left Caleb speechless. Joseph wasn't the first. He was just the latest in a long line of victims. The signature was witnessed, Alara said, by a notary public, Brenda Carr. Caleb's stomach dropped. Brenda? My project manager. One and the same. I found her notary license details. It's her. She's in on it, Cal. She's his accomplice. The pieces all slammed together. Abernathy's casual mention of Brenda being a friend. Her strange looks, her questions about how he was sleeping. She wasn't just a friendly manager. She was Abernathy's lookout. She was vetting the tenants, making sure they weren't the kind of people who would cause trouble. And she had witnessed the fraudulent transfer of Joseph's property. She was just as guilty as Abernathy. His world suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. He was surrounded. His landlord, his boss, they were a team. They had him isolated, and they were watching him. His plan to gather evidence just became infinitely more perilous. He couldn't trust anyone. The revelation that Brenda was involved landed like a physical blow. Caleb sat in his car on the dusty shoulder of County Road 21, the phone still pressed to his ear, and felt the last vestiges of his security evaporate. The worksite, which had been his only refuge from the oppressive strangeness of the house, was now hostile territory. Brenda's casual questions and knowing glances replayed in his mind, no longer benign but freighted with a sinister purpose. She wasn't just making small talk. She was gathering intelligence for Abernathy. Cal? Are you there? Alara's voice crackled with concern. Yeah, he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. Yeah, I'm here. She's my boss, Elle. I see her every day. You can't go back to work. You have to leave. Now, call in sick again. Tell them you're quitting, I don't care. Just get in the car and drive. And go where? If I run, they know they've won. They'll just find another tenant and do this to someone else. And Joseph is still here, with a shotgun. The image of the old man cleaning the weapon, his movements so deliberate, flashed in his mind. Was it for hunting, or for protecting his home from strangers? This is bigger than you, Caleb, Alara insisted. You've got evidence of a pattern of predatory behavior. A quitclaim deed for $1 witnessed by an accomplice? That's not just a jerk landlord, that's a criminal conspiracy. You need to go to the state police or the attorney general's office. Someone outside of that county. And say what? My boss and my landlord are crooks, and my proof is a public document that my sister the paralegal found online? They'll bury me in paperwork and ongoing investigations while Abernathy makes my life a living hell. I need more. I need something undeniable, something they can't dismiss. Like what? A signed confession? Like a recording, Caleb said, the idea forming as he spoke. If I can get Abernathy or Brenda to talk about what they did to Joseph, to admit he wasn't of sound mind, that would be different. A long silence stretched over the phone line. That is a spectacularly dangerous idea, Alara said finally. You are not an undercover cop, Cal. You're a geologist. I know, but they think I'm scared. They think I've backed down. Abernathy is arrogant. Brenda thinks I'm just some quiet kid. Maybe I can use that. He knew it was a wild gamble, but it was the only path he could see that didn't end with him either running away in defeat or being slowly crushed by Abernathy's influence. He had to go to work. He had to face Brenda. The next morning, he drove to the site, his stomach in knots. He had a small, discreet digital voice recorder he used for taking field notes, and it was nestled in his shirt pocket, switched on. The air was cool and damp, the sky a blanket of low-hanging gray clouds. Brenda was already there, standing by the equipment trailer, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. "Morning, Caleb," she said, her smile as practiced and pleasant as ever. "Feeling better?" "A bit," he said, avoiding her eyes as he grabbed his hard hat and safety vest. "Must have been a 24-hour bug. Glad to hear it. We've got a lot to get through today. I want to start taking core samples over in the West Quadrant. Abernathy wants to get this phase of the survey wrapped up." She mentioned the name so casually, a seamless part of her work chatter. They worked together for the first hour setting up the drilling rig. The mundane, physical labor was a strange counterpoint to the high-stakes deception playing out between them. Caleb tried to act normal, focusing on the tasks at hand, but he was acutely aware of the small electronic device in his pocket, recording every word, every rustle of clothing. He needed to steer the conversation toward Joseph. He waited for a moment when they were taking a break, leaning against the side of the company truck. "It's a strange area out here," Caleb began, trying to sound casual. "My rental house is interesting. They're all old farmhouses," Brenda said, taking a sip of her coffee. "They all have their quirks. This one has a neighbor with quirks," Caleb said, watching her face carefully. "An old guy named Joseph Bell. Seems a little confused. He actually showed up at my house the other night." Brenda's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Is that right, old Joe?" "Yeah, he's a local character. Harmless, though." She used the exact same word as Abernathy. Harmless. It was part of the script. "Well, he seemed to think he still lived there," Caleb pushed. "It was a little unnerving. The landlord, Mr. Abernathy, had to come out and smooth things over. This got a reaction." Brenda's jaw tightened. "Tom came out here? When?" "Night before last. Said he was worried I might be upsetting Joe. Told me to just leave the old man alone." Brenda stared at him for a long moment, her gaze analytical, searching. "Tom's just protective of Joe," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He's known him for years. Joe doesn't have anyone else, so Tom looks out for him. Makes sure he's okay." "Right," Caleb said. "Must be tough, though. The man seems to think his dead wife is still alive. He signed his house over for $1. Doesn't seem like someone who should be left on his own." He had laid the bait. He watched as a flicker of anger crossed Brenda's face before it was quickly suppressed and replaced by a look of stern professionalism. "Look, Caleb," she said, her voice low and firm. "Let me give you some friendly advice. Tom Abernathy is a good man, and what he does for Joe Bell is his business. It's complicated, and it's not your place to judge or interfere. Joe signed that deed of his own free will in my presence. He was perfectly lucid. He wanted Tom to have the house, to manage it for him. You are a temporary contractor here. Your job is to survey this land. That's it. Don't get involved in local matters you don't understand. It won't end well for you." It was a threat, wrapped in the guise of friendly advice, and it was a confession. He was perfectly lucid, a lie she would have to stand by, a lie he now had on tape. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. He had her on record defending the indefensible. The rest of the day was excruciatingly tense. He could feel Brenda's eyes on him, her suspicion now fully aroused. He focused on his work, his movements precise and economical, hoping his outward calm would mask the turmoil within. When he finally packed up his gear at the end of the day, Brenda walked over to his car. "Caleb," she said, stopping him before he could get in. "I hope we're clear. About Joe." "Crystal," he said, meeting her gaze. "Good," she said, "because Tom is not someone you want to cross. He's done a lot for this community. People are loyal to him." She let the words hang in the air before turning and walking back to her own truck. He drove away from the site, his heart pounding. He had the recording. It was thin, circumstantial, but it was something. It was proof of the narrative they were trying to sell. As he drove, a new thought, cold and sharp, cut through his sense of victory. Brenda had said, "People are loyal to him, not just her. People, plural." How deep did this go? Was the whole town in on it? Was he an outsider trying to unravel a conspiracy that everyone else had silently agreed to ignore? He pulled into his driveway and saw something that made him slam on the brakes. The front door of his house was wide open. It swung gently in the breeze, a dark, gaping invitation. He hadn't left it that way. He never left it that way. He killed the engine and sat for a long moment, staring at the open door. This wasn't Joseph's quiet, ghostly intrusion. This was a message, a blatant, aggressive statement. It was from Abernathy. It had to be. Brenda must have called him the second Caleb left the site. They knew he was pushing, and now they were pushing back. He grabbed the heavy tire iron from under his seat. His hands were slick with sweat as he got out of the car and walked slowly toward the house. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the car and drive away. But his equipment, his laptop, his entire life was inside. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. The house was silent. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the dark interior of the living room. Nothing seemed out of place from what he could see. He nudged the door open wider with his foot and stepped across the threshold. And then the smell hit him. A thick, coppery, sickeningly sweet smell. The smell of blood. He followed the scent, his tire iron held high. It led him to the kitchen, and what he saw there made him stop dead, his breath catching in his throat. On the floor, in a spreading, dark pool, lay Joseph Bell. His eyes were open and vacant, staring at the ceiling. The old, single-barrel shotgun lay beside him. Caleb's mind recoiled from the scene, a silent scream lodging in his throat. The world narrowed to the still figure on the floor, the dark pool spreading across the cracked linoleum, the overwhelming, metallic scent of blood. Joseph. He was too late. All his maneuvering, his dangerous games with Abernathy and Brenda, had been for nothing. While he was trying to save Joseph, the old man had ended his own quiet tragedy in the house. He could never bring himself to leave. Or had he? A cold, sharp thought cut through the initial wave of horror and grief. The front door had been wide open. Joseph, with his ghostly quiet, would never have left a door open. That was Abernathy's style. A loud, flagrant display of power. And the shotgun, Joseph had been cleaning it, but would he have brought it here? To his wife's house? Felt wrong. Felt staged. Caleb backed away from the kitchen, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't call 911 from the house. He would be the one to find the body, the tenant who had been complaining about the victim. He would be the primary suspect. Abernathy and Brenda would have the perfect story. The new guy from the city, agitated and unstable, had a confrontation with the harmless old man. They would have his APS report, retracted or not, as evidence of his obsession with Joseph. They would destroy him. He stumbled out the front door, the tire iron feeling flimsy and useless in his hand. He didn't look back. He got in his Civic, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, and fumbled with the keys. He threw the car into reverse, spitting gravel as he tore out of the driveway, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Abernathy's dark SUV blocking his escape. But the road was empty. He drove, not toward Logan, but deeper into the winding country roads, his mind racing. He had to call the police. He couldn't just run. But he couldn't call them from here. He needed to be somewhere else, somewhere public. He needed to establish a timeline that put him far away from that kitchen. He found himself on the outskirts of Laurelville, a small town 20 minutes away. He pulled into the parking lot of a brightly lit Dollar General, the mundane fluorescence a jarring contrast to the horror he had just fled. He sat in the car, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm himself, to think like a surveyor again. Evidence. Facts. What did he know? Fact 1. Joseph was dead in his kitchen. Fact 2. The front door was open when he arrived. Fact 3. Abernathy and Brenda knew he was investigating them. Fact 4. He had a voice recording of Brenda lying about Joseph's mental state and threatening him. That recording, which had seemed like such a thin piece of evidence an hour ago, was now his lifeline. It was proof of the conspiracy, proof of a motive for them to silence not just him, but potentially Joseph as well. He dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, he pitched his voice with a note of controlled panic he didn't have to feign. "My name is Caleb Thorne," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm a contractor working in Hocking County. I'm calling about my landlord, Thomas Abernathy, and my project manager, Brenda Carr. I have reason to believe they are involved in the death of an elderly man named Joseph Bell." He gave the dispatcher the address of the rental house. He explained, in a torrent of words, the situation: Abernathy's exploitation of Joseph, Brenda's complicity, their threats against him. He told them about the recording. "I'm afraid for my life," he said, the words tasting like truth. "I think they might have killed him and are trying to frame me for it. I'm at the Dollar General in Laurelville. I'm not going back to that house." The dispatcher, a calm, professional woman, took his information and told him to stay where he was, that a sheriff's deputy would be dispatched to his location and others to the house. The wait was agonizing. Every car that pulled into the parking lot sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. Was it the police? Or was it Abernathy, having realized his plan had gone wrong? Finally, a Hocking County Sheriff's patrol car pulled up behind his Civic. A deputy, a young man with a serious expression, got out and approached his window cautiously. Caleb put his hands on the steering wheel, making sure they were visible. The deputy asked him to step out of the vehicle. Caleb complied, explaining the entire story again, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. He played the recording for the deputy right there in the parking lot, the small speaker on his phone filling the quiet night with Brenda's chilling, friendly advice. The deputy listened intently, his expression unreadable. He took the phone, telling Caleb it was now evidence. He took his statement, then told him he had to come to the station in Logan. He wasn't under arrest, the deputy clarified, but he was a material witness in a potential homicide. He would have to ride in the back of the patrol car. His Civic would be towed to the station as part of the investigation. The ride to Logan was a blur. The world outside the caged window seemed distant and unreal. At the station, a sterile, cinder-block building that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, he was placed in a small, windowless interview room. He repeated his story for a third time, this time to a grim-faced detective named Rodriguez, who looked like he hadn't smiled since the turn of the century. Rodriguez listened without interruption, his pen scratching across a notepad. When Caleb finished, the detective leaned back in his chair, his eyes hard. "It's a fantastic story, Mr. Thorne," Rodriguez said, his voice a low rumble. "A secret tunnel, predatory landlord, corporate conspiracy, and you, the young hero, trying to expose it all." "It's the truth," Caleb said, his voice pleading. "Every word. The truth is that we have a dead man in your rental kitchen with a shotgun wound. The shotgun has been identified as belonging to him. Forensics is on the scene now, but the initial assessment points to suicide. And you're the one who has spent the last week harassing him and his caretaker, Mr. Abernathy. You filed a complaint against them. You admit to trespassing on Mr. Bell's property. It doesn't look good for you. Abernathy isn't his caretaker. He's his abuser," Caleb insisted. "He and Brenda Carr killed him or drove him to it, and they're trying to pin it on me. Did you listen to the recording? I've listened to the recording, Rodriguez said dismissively. It's a conversation where your boss tells you to mind your own business. It's not the smoking gun you think it is. Despair washed over Caleb. He was right. It was his word against theirs, and they were established members of the community. He was the outsider, the troublemaker. Abernathy had built his defenses well. He spent the rest of the night and most of the next morning in that small room, drinking lukewarm water from a paper cup. Rodriguez and other detectives came and went, asking the same questions in different ways, trying to trip him up. They took his fingerprints, swabbed his cheeks for DNA. He was not a suspect, they kept saying, but he was not free to go either. Late in the afternoon, Rodriguez came back into the room. He dropped a file on the metal table. Thomas Abernathy and Brenda Carr have been here all morning. They have a lawyer. They tell a very different story from you. They say you became fixated on Old Man Bell, that you were aggressive, unstable. They were worried about what you might do, worried you might push the old man over the edge. That's a lie. Caleb slammed his hand on the table. Maybe, Rodriguez said, his expression unchanged. But they also brought something else. Financial records. Abernathy has been paying all of Joseph Bell's bills for the last 8 years, from a trust account set up in Bell's name. Property taxes, utilities on the other house, even a weekly stipend for groceries. It looks on paper like he really was taking care of him. Caleb stared at him, bewildered. A trust? It didn't make sense. Abernathy was a predator. Why would he? And then it hit him. It was the perfect cover. The trust was likely funded by Abernathy selling off other assets that had belonged to Joseph, timber rights, mineral rights, anything of value on the land that wasn't the house itself. He was paying for Joseph's care with Joseph's own money, all while looking like a saint on paper. It was a brilliant, evil shell game. You have to look deeper, Caleb pleaded. Where did the money in that trust come from? Rodriguez sighed, looking weary. We are. But these things take time. For now, we have a dead man and a whole lot of conflicting stories. He stood up. You're free to go, Mr. Thorne, but don't leave the county. We'll be in touch. They released him into the late afternoon sun. He was cleared, but not exonerated. He had no car, no phone, no place to stay. The house was a crime scene. His life was in ruins. He stood on the steps of the sheriff's station, a free man who had never felt more trapped. He had told the truth, but the truth wasn't enough. Abernathy and Brenda were still out there, protected by their wall of lies and influence. The investigation would crawl along, and they would walk away clean. He knew it. As he stood there, wondering what to do next, a car pulled up to the curb. It was his sister, Elara. She had driven the 3 hours from Columbus as soon as she'd heard he was being held. He had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. He got into the passenger seat, and the relief was so overwhelming that he finally broke, the horror and fear of the last 48 hours pouring out of him in ragged sobs. It's okay, Cal, she said, her hand on his shoulder. It's okay. We're going to fight this. We're going to burn them to the ground. But as they drove away from Logan, Caleb looked back at the rolling, tree-covered hills. He knew it wasn't over. Abernathy and Brenda wouldn't just let him walk away. They knew he was the only person who knew the full truth. The investigation might not be a threat to them, but he was, and they were still out there. The days following his release were a blur of sterile motel rooms and hushed, frantic phone calls. Elara, a force of nature in her professional paralegal mode, refused to let him retreat into a shell of despair. They stayed in a town an hour away from Hocking County, a neutral ground where Caleb felt he could breathe without tasting the county's oppressive atmosphere. Elara worked her phone and laptop relentlessly, calling state-level agencies, legal aid societies, and investigative journalists. The response was dishearteningly uniform. The official investigation into Joseph Bell's death was ongoing, but the preliminary label of apparent suicide acted as a bureaucratic shield. No one wanted to touch a case that local law enforcement had already unofficially closed. The story of financial exploitation was intriguing but complex. A he said, She said civil matter that would take years and a mountain of money to litigate. The recording of Brenda was noted, but without more context, it was not the bombshell Caleb had imagined. "They're all giving us the runaround," Alara said, snapping her laptop shut in frustration after a particularly dismissive call with a state investigator. "They see Hocking County Sheriff's Office on the file and they back off. They don't want to step on local toes unless they have an airtight case handed to them on a silver platter." Caleb stared out the motel window at the endless river of cars on the highway. "So they get away with it," he said, the words flat and dead. "They drove a man to his death, and they're going to walk away because they have friends and a good lawyer." "No," Alara said, her eyes flashing with a fierce light. "No, we're not done. If the legal system won't work, we'll go around it. You said it yourself, Cal. Abernathy owns other properties. Joseph wasn't the first. What if we can find another victim, or a relative of a victim, someone else with a story to tell?" It was a long shot, a search for a needle in a haystack of public records and forgotten lives. But it was a flicker of hope. Using the list of properties Alara had already pulled, they began to dig. They spent days cross-referencing names of former owners with obituaries, probate records, and social media. Most were dead ends. People who had died of old age, their properties passing to Abernathy through what looked on the surface like legitimate channels. But then they found one. A woman named Maria Flores in a neighboring county. According to the records, her father, Hector Flores, had signed his small farm over to Abernathy's holding company 9 years ago, also via a $1 quitclaim deed. An online obituary stated that Hector had died 2 years later in a state-run nursing facility, suffering from a long illness. Alara found a current address for Maria Flores in a small town just outside of Cincinnati. "This is it," Alara said, her finger tapping the screen. "She's the one. If her father died in a state facility, that means he wasn't living on his property. It's the same pattern." Caleb felt the first stirrings of adrenaline he'd had since leaving the sheriff's station. Let's go talk to her." They drove the next day, a 2-hour trip through the flat, expansive farmland of central Ohio. Maria Flores lived in a modest, well-kept duplex. When Caleb knocked on the door, it was answered by a woman in her late 50s with tired, intelligent eyes. Caleb and Alara introduced themselves, explaining they were investigating Thomas Abernathy in relation to a similar property transfer in Hocking County. At the mention of Abernathy's name, Maria's face hardened. She invited them in. They sat in her small, tidy living room as she told them a story that was chillingly familiar. Her father, a widower and a proud farmer, had begun showing signs of memory loss. A friendly, helpful man named Tom Abernathy had appeared, at first offering to help with chores, then with finances. "He was so charming," Maria said, her voice laced with a bitter irony. "He told my dad he'd help him manage the farm, make sure he could stay in his home. He said he'd set up a trust. I lived 2 hours away. I had my own kids, my own job. I trusted him. My father trusted him. The trust. It was the same shell game. Then the call started," Maria continued. "My dad would call me, confused, talking about how Tom was bringing strangers to look at the farm. Then one day, a neighbor called me, said there was an ambulance at my dad's house. Abernathy had him committed, said he'd had a psychotic break. By the time I got there, my dad was gone, and Abernathy had a power of attorney document I'd never seen before. The quitclaim deed had been signed a week later, witnessed by a notary." Caleb felt a cold certainty. Was the notary's name Brenda Carr? Maria's eyes widened. "Yes. How did you know?" "She's his partner," Alara said, her voice grim. "She's the project manager at my brother's former job. He sold the farm 6 months after my father died," Maria finished, her voice thick with emotion. "For almost $500,000. I tried to fight it. I hired a lawyer, but Abernathy's paperwork was perfect. The power of attorney, the deed, it was all legal. My lawyer said my father was deemed competent by the state at the time of the signing. It was hopeless. That man stole my father's entire life, and he did it with a pen. Maria's story was the missing piece. It was the pattern, the proof that Joseph Bell wasn't an isolated tragedy but part of a calculated, predatory operation. She had legal documents, correspondence from her failed lawsuit, a history of trying to fight Abernathy. She was a credible, powerful witness. "Will you help us?" Caleb asked. "Will you be willing to give a statement to the state police? To a reporter? If we go public with your story and mine, they won't be able to ignore it." Tears welled in Maria's eyes. "For 9 years, I have prayed that man would face justice. Yes, I will help." Armed with a new witness and a trove of documents from her previous legal battle, Alara reached out not to the police, but to an investigative reporter at the Columbus Dispatch she knew through her work. This time, the story was too compelling to dismiss. A grieving daughter, a dead old man, a young whistleblower, and a shadowy landlord with a string of suspiciously acquired properties. It had all the makings of a major exposé. The reporter, a tenacious woman named Sarah Jenkins, met with them the next day. She listened to Caleb's story, then to Maria's. She reviewed the documents, her excitement growing with every page. "This is big," she said. "This isn't just a local crime story. This is a story about the systemic failure to protect the elderly. I'm going to run with this." The next week was a whirlwind. Sarah Jenkins and her team descended on Hocking County. They interviewed neighbors, local officials, and former employees of Abernathy's various shell companies. They uncovered 2 more families who had similar stories, though they had been too intimidated or exhausted to fight. The wall of silence Abernathy had so carefully constructed began to crumble. The story broke on a Sunday, on the front page of the Columbus Dispatch, under the headline, "The Whispering Vultures, a predatory real estate scheme in rural Ohio." It detailed Abernathy's methods, Brenda Carr's complicity, and the tragic stories of Joseph Bell and Hector Flores. It featured Caleb's harrowing experience at the rental house and Maria Flores's long, fruitless fight for justice. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The state attorney general's office, publicly shamed by the article, announced a full-scale investigation into Abernathy Holdings and all its related entities. The Hocking County Sheriff's Office, facing scrutiny for its handling of Joseph Bell's death, reopened the case, this time as a suspicious death investigation, and formally requested assistance from the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Caleb and Alara watched it all unfold from their motel room. He felt a sense of vindication, but it was hollow, tainted by the knowledge that it had cost Joseph his life. A few days later, he got a call from Detective Rodriguez. His voice was different this time, stripped of its earlier cynicism. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "the BCI's preliminary forensics report on the Bell case came back. There was gunshot residue on Joseph Bell's hands, consistent with a self-inflicted wound. But there was something else. His toxicology report. He had a massive dose of a powerful sedative in his system, a dose large enough to render him completely incapacitated. There is no way he could have lifted that shotgun, let alone pulled the trigger." Caleb's blood ran cold. "So he was drugged." "He was drugged," Rodriguez confirmed. "And then someone else put the gun in his hands and staged it to look like a suicide. This is now a homicide investigation. We've just issued warrants for the arrest of Thomas Abernathy and Brenda Carr." It was over. The truth was out, undeniable and backed by forensic science. They hadn't gotten away with it. That evening, Caleb drove with Alara back to Hocking County one last time. He had to retrieve his car and what was left of his belongings. The rental house was still cordoned off with yellow police tape, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded there. As he stood looking at it from the road, a profound sadness washed over him. The house wasn't evil. It was just a house. It was the people, the greed, and the cruelty that had haunted it. He thought of Joseph, a lonely man lost in his own memories, and hoped that somewhere, somehow, he had finally found peace with Eleanor and his son, Michael. He had come to this place looking for a job, for a start to his career. Instead, he had found the dark, hidden contours of human nature. He had survived, but he knew the quiet, rolling hills of Hocking County, and the memory of the abandoned house would stay with him forever. The sense of an ending, of a chapter closed, was a fragile illusion that lasted less than 24 hours. Caleb and Alara were packing their bags in the motel room, a feeling of weary triumph settling over them, when Caleb's phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was for Columbus. He answered, putting it on speaker. "Is this Caleb Thorne?" A crisp, professional voice asked. "Yes, speaking. Mr. Thorne, my name is Marcus Thorne. No relation, unfortunately. I'm with the Ohio Attorney General's Office White-Collar Crime Division. I'm the lead prosecutor assigned to the Abernathy case." Caleb and Alara exchanged a look of surprise. "Okay," Caleb said. "What can I do for you?" "First, let me thank you for your courage in coming forward. It's not an easy thing to do. Second, I need to prepare you for what comes next. Thomas Abernathy and Brenda Carr had their arraignment this morning. I'm sure you assume they are safely behind bars." "Yes," Caleb said. "The warrants were for homicide." "The warrants were for suspicion of homicide." The prosecutor corrected him gently. "The initial charges filed were for involuntary manslaughter, financial exploitation of the elderly, and tampering with evidence. We're still building the murder one case." As a result, the judge set bail. A cold knot formed in Caleb's stomach. Bail? For a homicide investigation? Abernathy is a wealthy man, Mr. Thorne. He has deep roots in the community and is not considered a flight risk by the court. He posted a $2 million bond an hour ago. Brenda Carr's was $100,000. He paid that for her as well. They've been released. The air went out of the room. Caleb sank onto the edge of the bed, the phone still in his hand. They were out. After everything, after a dead body and a front-page expose, they were out on the street. "They're not to have any contact with you or any other potential witnesses, of course?" Marcus Thorne continued, his voice taking on a grim tone. "A restraining order is in effect. But I'll be blunt with you. Abernathy has hired a legal team from a top firm in Cleveland. They're already on the offensive. They're painting you as an unstable, obsessive individual who harassed Mr. Bell to the point of suicide. They are claiming the sedatives in his system were from an unknown third party, and that Abernathy is the victim of a smear campaign by a sensationalist newspaper and a vindictive former tenant." "But that's insane," Alara burst out. "The evidence. Their job is to create doubt," the prosecutor said wearily, "and they're very good at it. This is going to be a long, ugly fight, which is why I'm calling. We need your full cooperation. You are our star witness. We're going to need a formal, on-the-record deposition as soon as possible. And Mr. Thorne, I strongly advise you and your sister to be extremely careful. Abernathy is a cornered animal, and his lawyers are just the public face of his defense." The call ended, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. The victory Caleb had felt was a mirage. This wasn't the end of the game. It was the start of a new, more dangerous one, played on a much larger board. They drove back to Columbus in near silence, the landscape outside the car window a meaningless blur. Alara dropped him at her apartment, a small, safe haven in the city's sprawling anonymity. That night, Caleb watched the local news. A reporter stood on the steps of the Hocking County Courthouse. And then he saw him, Thomas Abernathy, dressed in a sharp suit, walking briskly to a black sedan, surrounded by a phalanx of lawyers. He looked confident, unbowed. One of the lawyers, a sharp-faced man with silver hair, stopped to give a statement. "My client, Mr. Abernathy, is a philanthropist who has been unjustly accused by a disturbed young man with a history of erratic behavior," the lawyer said smoothly into the microphones. "Mr. Abernathy was a devoted caretaker to the late Mr. Bell, and we have the financial records to prove it. We are confident that when all the facts come out, my client will be fully exonerated, and we will be filing a significant defamation lawsuit against all parties involved in this malicious persecution." Caleb felt physically ill. They were turning it around, using their power and money to rewrite the narrative in real time. He was no longer the whistleblower. He was the disturbed young man. The next few weeks were a descent into a new kind of psychological warfare. The deposition with the prosecutor, Marcus Thorne, was grueling. A 12-hour marathon where Caleb had to recount every detail, every feeling, every nuance of his time at the house. Abernathy's lawyers were present, their faces impassive masks as they listened, their pens scratching notes that Caleb knew would be used to dissect and discredit him later. His life was put under a microscope. His university records were subpoenaed. His former professors and landlords were contacted. His social media was scoured. A private investigator, undoubtedly hired by Abernathy's team, was spotted parked across the street from Alara's apartment. The restraining order was a piece of paper. The intimidation was constant and suffocating. He tried to find a new job, but Abernathy's threat had been prophetic. The story was out there, and no one wanted to hire the unstable star witness in a high-profile homicide case. His career in geology was frozen, perhaps permanently. Then the other witnesses began to waver. Maria Flores called Alara, her voice trembling. A man had shown up at her house, offering her a settlement on behalf of Mr. Abernathy, a check for $200,000, if she would sign a sworn affidavit retracting her story and stating her father had been of sound mind. It was a blatant attempt at witness tampering, but it was also a life-changing amount of money for her. She had refused, but she was terrified. The reporter, Sarah Jenkins, found the tires on her car slashed. The dispatch received a notice of intent to sue for defamation, a legal tactic designed to bleed the newspaper's resources and intimidate them into silence. The walls were closing in. Abernathy wasn't just defending himself in court. He was waging a war on all fronts, using his wealth as a weapon to terrorize and exhaust his accusers. Caleb felt himself becoming isolated and paranoid. Every unfamiliar car, every unknown phone number, sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He was living in his sister's spare room, unemployed, his future uncertain. He felt a growing sense of hopelessness. Maybe Abernathy was too powerful to beat. One rainy Tuesday, a package arrived for him. It was a small, padded envelope with no return address, postmarked from Logan, Ohio. Alara looked at it with suspicion. "You shouldn't open that. It's probably just more legal harassment," Caleb said wearily. He tore it open. Inside, there was no letter, no threat. There was only a single old-fashioned brass key. He recognized it instantly. It was the key to the rental house. The key he had left on the kitchen counter when he'd fled. The key that should have been in a police evidence locker. How had someone gotten it? And why send it to him? He tipped the envelope, and something else fell out, wrapped in a small piece of cloth. It was a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird. He had seen it before. It was on the mantelpiece in Joseph Bell's dilapidated house, the one time he had been inside. There was no note, but the message was clear. It was a reminder. "We know where you are. We can get to you, and we have been in places you thought were safe." The key wasn't just a key to a house. It was a key to his fear. Abernathy was turning his own psychological tactics back on him, reminding him of the terror and uncertainty he had felt in that isolated place. The fight was far from over. It had just gotten deeply personal. The key and the carved bird were a masterstroke of psychological terror. They weren't overtly threatening, nothing he could take to the police as a violation of the restraining order. They were intimate, symbolic. They proved that Abernathy's reach extended far beyond his lawyers and private investigators. He had someone on the inside of the investigation, someone with access to an evidence locker. The corruption ran deeper than Caleb had ever imagined. He showed the items to Marcus Thorne, the prosecutor. Thorne's face grew grim. "This is witness intimidation, pure and simple," he said. "But it's deniable. Abernathy will claim he has no knowledge of it, that it was a sympathizer of his. We can't prove it came from him." He took the key and the bird, sealing them in an evidence bag. "But this does tell me one thing. They're scared. You, Mr. Thorne, and Maria Flores are the linchpins of this case. Without your testimony, their whole story falls apart. They're trying to break you before you get to the stand." The knowledge that he was getting to them was cold comfort. The intimidation escalated. Alara's car was broken into, her glove compartment rifled through, but nothing was taken. It was another message. Caleb started receiving hang-up calls in the middle of the night. Abernathy's legal team filed a motion to have Caleb's testimony thrown out, citing his documented history of mental instability and paranoid delusions regarding the house. They were using his initial fear, the very real terror he had experienced, as a weapon against his credibility. He felt himself starting to unravel. He barely slept. He lost weight. The four walls of Alara's apartment began to feel like a prison. He was jumpy, irritable, and the face of Joseph Bell, vacant-eyed on the kitchen floor, haunted his waking moments. He was suffering from the classic symptoms of PTSD, but seeking therapy felt like a trap. Any diagnosis would become another weapon for Abernathy's lawyers to use against him in court. Alara saw the toll it was taking. "You can't let him do this to you, Cal," she said one evening, her face etched with worry. "He's trying to make you into the unstable person he claims you are. You have to fight back. Not with lawyers and police, but for yourself." "How?" he asked, his voice hollow. "He's everywhere. He's a ghost haunting my whole life." "You're a surveyor," she said, her voice firm. "You find things that are buried. Abernathy's whole life is built on secrets. There have to be more. That tunnel, Joseph said his father helped him dig it. Why? What were they hiding from? What else is buried on that land?" Her words sparked something in him, a flicker of the old resolve. He had been so focused on the legal battle, on defending himself, that he had forgotten how this all started, with a mystery, a house that held secrets. He had never fully explored the tunnel. He had been too scared. He had assumed it just led from one house to the other. But what if it was more than that? What if it led to the answers he needed? It was a reckless, dangerous idea. The house was still a sealed crime scene. Going back there would be illegal, a violation that could destroy his credibility forever if he were caught. But what credibility did he have left to lose? Abernathy's team was already painting him as a criminal. "I have to go back," he said, the decision solidifying as he spoke the words. "I have to see where that tunnel goes." Alara protested, argued, pleaded with him not to go. It was too risky, but she saw the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had to see something through to the end, no matter the cost. Reluctantly, she agreed to help him on one condition. She would go with him. They planned it like a covert operation. They chose a moonless, rainy night, the kind of night where the world felt shrouded and hidden. They drove to Hocking County in Alara's car, parking a mile away from the properties on a deserted logging road. They were dressed in dark clothing, armed with powerful flashlights, a crowbar, and a newfound sense of desperate purpose. The walk through the wet woods was eerie. The rental house, when it emerged from the trees, was a dark, hulking shape against the gray sky, the yellow police tape sagging and torn by the weather. The place felt even more menacing now, a known quantity of horror. Getting in was the first challenge. The doors and windows were sealed with official police stickers. But Caleb remembered the cellar. The entrance wasn't from the house itself, but from the outside, the tunnel. He led Alara not to his old rental, but to the derelict property where Joseph Bell had lived. The shed was as he remembered it, its door hanging from a single hinge. Inside, the dark hole in the dirt floor waited for them. "This is it," he whispered. "This is how he got in and out." They descended into the darkness, a steep dirt ramp leading down into the tunnel itself. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and rot. The beam of Caleb's flashlight cut through the oppressive black, illuminating the rotting timbers that held up the ceiling. They moved slowly, carefully, deeper into the earth. The tunnel was longer than Caleb had expected. After about 100 yards, it opened into the small, stone-walled cellar beneath his rental house. This was as far as he had gone before. The heavy stone door that led up to the kitchen was still closed. But Caleb noticed something he had missed in his panic-stricken explorations before. The tunnel didn't just end in the cellar. It continued. A second, narrower passage branched off to the left, a passage he hadn't seen because his attention had been focused on the cellar itself. "This is it," he breathed. "It goes somewhere else." They followed the new passage. It was tighter, the ceiling lower, forcing them to crouch. After another 50 feet, it ended not in a door, but at a crude wooden ladder leading straight up. Caleb went first, pushing against the trapdoor at the top. It gave way with a shower of dirt and dried leaves. He poked his head out. They were inside the collapsed, dilapidated shed in the backyard of the rental property. The child's rocking chair was gone, but the tunnel system connected both sheds and the cellar, a secret network crisscrossing the property. "It's a complete rat's maze," Alara whispered, shining her light around the shed's interior. "Why would anyone need this?" "Joseph said they built it during a war scare," Caleb recalled. "But this is more than a simple bomb shelter." He scanned the floor of the shed. In the corner, half buried under a pile of rotting burlap sacks, the same pile where he had first seen the blue rocking chair, was a small metal lockbox, rusted and covered in grime. It was the kind of thing one would use to store important documents. He knelt down, his heart pounding. He wedged the crowbar under the lid. With a screech of protesting metal, the lock broke and the lid popped open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, was not a document, but a collection of objects. A child's silver locket, tarnished with age, a small, worn leather-bound diary, and a stack of old, black and white photographs, tied with a faded ribbon. Caleb picked up the diary. The ink inside was faded, the handwriting a delicate, feminine script. It was Eleanor Bell's. He opened it to a random page, dated over 50 years ago. "Joseph is digging again," he read aloud, his voice low. "He says it is for our protection, but I see the fear in his eyes. It is not the Russians he fears. It is the men from the glass works. He saw what they buried in the woods. He says they cannot be allowed to find it. He says we must protect the boy." Caleb's blood ran cold. The glass works, the defunct factory next to his survey site. He flipped through the photographs. They were pictures of a young boy, Michael, Joseph, and Eleanor's son. But there was another boy in several of the photos, a boy with dark, intense eyes who looked strikingly familiar. He came to the last photo in the stack. It was a picture of the two boys, Michael Bell and the other boy, standing proudly with their fathers. One man was a younger Joseph Bell. The other man, Caleb felt a jolt of shock, his breath catching in his throat. The other man was a younger, thinner version of Thomas Abernathy. The diary, the photos, the mention of the glass works. It all clicked into place, revealing a secret far older and darker than he could have ever imagined. Abernathy's connection to this land wasn't just about real estate. It was a lifelong secret, buried for half a century. And Joseph Bell wasn't just his victim. He was his keeper. Caleb stared at the photograph, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The faces of the two fathers, Joseph Bell and a young Thomas Abernathy, smiled for a camera that had clicked half a century ago. Standing in front of them were two boys, Michael Bell and a dark-eyed boy Caleb now knew was Abernathy's younger brother. "My God," Alara whispered, reading over his shoulder from the diary. "Listen to this, Cal. October 12th. Tom Sr. was drunk again. He came from the factory angry, yelling about a spoiled batch of glass. He took it out on little Tommy as usual. Joseph tried to step in, but Tom Sr. shoved him back. I took Michael and ran inside. Later, Joseph came in, his face as white as a sheet. He said Tommy wasn't getting up. The story was there, written between the lines of Eleanor's fearful entries. It wasn't a quarry accident that killed Michael Bell. The diary never mentioned Michael dying. It was Abernathy's brother who had been the victim. Joseph Bell had been the sole witness to a murder committed by Thomas Abernathy's father. The secret they had all been keeping, the reason for the tunnel, wasn't about a war scare. It was about hiding from a violent, powerful man. And Abernathy. Caleb pieced it together, his voice low with dawning horror. He wasn't protecting his father's memory. He was protecting his legacy. His entire life, his wealth, it was all built on an inheritance from a murderer. Joseph was the only loose end. With his mind failing, he was becoming a liability. He might start talking about the wrong dead boy. The whole sordid picture came into focus. Abernathy hadn't just preyed on a confused old man. He had been curating and containing a 50-year-old secret. The isolation, the gaslighting, the control, it was all to ensure Joseph never spoke the truth. And when Caleb arrived and started asking questions, he threatened to unravel it all. Joseph's death became a necessity, a final, brutal act of silencing. "We have it," Elara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and triumph. "This is it. This is the motive for everything." "It's not enough," Caleb countered, his mind racing. "His lawyers will say it's the ramblings of a troubled woman. They'll say the photos prove nothing more than a family friendship. We need more than a story, El. We need a body." His gaze fell on the diary again. He saw what they buried in the woods next to the glass works, the land he had been surveying. He suddenly remembered the topographical maps, the ground-penetrating radar scans he had taken for the contamination survey. He had been looking for chemical plumes, for barrels of industrial waste. But the radar had shown other anomalies, deep beneath the surface. Pockets of disturbed earth that didn't fit the pattern of illegal dumping. At the time, he had dismissed them as geological variations, maybe buried boulders or root systems. Now he knew better. "I think I know where he is," Caleb whispered. "I have the maps. I can find him." They didn't go back through the tunnel. They slipped out of the shed and into the rainy darkness, melting back into the woods. The risk of presenting illegally obtained evidence was nothing compared to the risk of letting Abernathy walk free. The next morning, they walked into the Attorney General's office. They didn't ask for a meeting. They demanded one. In a sterile conference room, they laid it all out for Marcus Thorne. The diary, the photographs, and Caleb's topographical maps with the anomalies circled in red. "I'm a geological surveyor," Caleb said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "This is my expertise. The ground here has been disturbed in a way that is inconsistent with geological formation or industrial dumping. It's consistent with a single, deep excavation. A grave. I can take you to the exact spot." Faced with the diary's narrative, the photographic evidence of the relationship, and the scientific data from an expert witness, the prosecutor finally had an undeniable, interlocking case. Within hours, he had secured a warrant. The dig began the following afternoon. The air was thick with a media circus, helicopters buzzing overhead. Abernathy's silver-haired lawyer was there, protesting loudly about the desecration of private property based on the fantasies of a disturbed individual. But he was kept back, behind a police line, his power finally useless against the force of a search warrant. Caleb stood with Marcus Thorne and Detective Rodriguez, watching as an excavation team carefully began to remove the earth from one of the spots he had marked. The work was slow, meticulous. Hours passed. Then one of the excavators stopped. He called over the forensic chief. There was a hush as they knelt, working with brushes and trowels. They found it 4 feet down, the small, fragile skeleton of a young boy, and clutched in the skeletal remains of his hand was a small, silver locket, identical to the one they had found in Eleanor Bell's lockbox. The discovery broke the case wide open. Faced with the irrefutable proof of his family's murderous secret, Brenda Carr's loyalty fractured. In exchange for a plea deal, she gave a full confession. She told them everything. How Abernathy had confided the family secret to her years ago, how they had managed Joseph together, and how, on that final night, Abernathy had panicked. He had gone to Joseph's house, drugged the old man's coffee, and then, with Brenda's help, carried him through the tunnel to the rental house kitchen, staging the suicide with cold, methodical precision. The news report showed Thomas Abernathy being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The charges were now first-degree murder. His empire, built on a foundation of secrets and bones, had crumbled to dust. Months later, the legal battles were over. Abernathy was convicted, sentenced to life without parole. Brenda received a lesser sentence for her cooperation. The whispers in Hocking County finally had a voice and a name. Caleb never went back to being a geological surveyor for a corporate firm. The experience had changed him too profoundly. He took a job with a non-profit environmental advocacy group, using his skills to help communities fight against corporate pollution and land misuse, finding what was buried in a different sense. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after it all began, he drove back to County Road 21. He didn't stop at the rental house, which had been sold to a new family who knew nothing of its history. He drove to the small, local cemetery. He found 2 headstones side by side, Eleanor Bell and Joseph Bell, and next to them, a new, small stone had been placed, paid for by an anonymous donation from Maria Flores. It read, Michael Bell. Caleb stood there for a long time, the quiet of the hills settling around him. The house had never been the source of the horror. It had only been a vessel, a silent witness to the very human ghosts of grief, guilt, and greed. He had arrived a year ago looking for a simple job, and had stumbled into the dark, tangled heart of a forgotten story. He had survived, and he had brought the truth to light. And as he turned to leave, he felt the profound, quiet weight of a final, settled peace.